Good morning. Welcome. I'm Patricia Muradian. I'm president of the Henry Ford, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you here this morning to Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. We have a special presentation prepared and a very important conversation about painful events in our history that both wounded and strengthened us, Detroit, as a community. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the tumultuous summer of 1967 in Detroit. And for today's program, we are very honored to partner with our friends from the Detroit Historical Society in its significant community engagement project, Detroit 67, looking back to move forward. Many of you may have already seen their exhibition, Detroit 67 Perspectives, and I'm pleased to welcome with us today the Senior Curator of Detroit Historical Museum, Joel Stone. Joel, raise your hand. Welcome, glad you're here. And we have numerous people in our audience as well from our own museum and historical staff, so welcome to all of you as well, and to all of our special friends and guests. As part of this collaboration, we are so pleased to present today's program featuring Professor Heather Ann Thompson. Heather Ann Thompson is a University of Michigan history professor who lived in Detroit as a teenager and graduated from Cass Tech. She is a nationally known expert on mass incarceration and has won the Pulitzer Prize for her book, Blood in the Water, The Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy. Professor Thompson offers a whole new perspective on Detroit's collapse following 1967 uprising, and she will be joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists from the Detroit Free Press, WDET, and Detroit Public Television, Stephen Henderson. So welcome. I thank you all for being here, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to Professor Heather Ann Thomas.
So, good morning. This is quite an intimidating venue, I must say. We have all of you sitting here, and then there's all of you, all of you behind. So, thank you so much for being here. I am going to talk to you today about something that I know you've seen a lot of in the news lately, which is about the anniversary of the Detroit Uprising of 1967. I know some of you have seen the recent movie, Detroit, some of you? Perhaps a few. So you'll find, I think, this talk timely, but you might be a little surprised by the take on it. And I want to really thank the Henry Ford Museum. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, for giving me the opportunity to share this with you, because I think it's a take on Detroit, the Detroit that I know many of us are from, many of us love, and some of us still live in or are moving back to. And so I think it's really important that we take this moment of the 67 anniversary and think about how is it that we got here today? And by today, I mean a mixed bag. I mean, how did we get to a city that used to be the 5th largest city in the nation, one of the most booming, exciting places to be for some people in 1967, to a city that suffered so mightily, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, to a city that today boosters are touting as, and this kind of makes me shudder, but I'll say it, the new Brooklyn. So I think we have a lot to explain, and a lot of us are trying to do that. I'm a historian by training, and I wrote a book in 2001 about Detroit and what had sort of happened after the 60s that has just been reissued. So this is kind of the occasion of me rediscovering this topic and talking about it with you. So to do that, I want to just first take a little bit of a walk down memory lane, which is to say, what is the city that used to be, or the city that folks talk about as the city that used to be? This is a very old picture, as you can see, of the city, but it's really emblematic of Detroit the quote-unquote glory days, the Detroit that was just the mecca of the auto industry, but also a real magnet for people from all over the world and from the south to the north. This is a city that people would be maybe not surprised to know was the apple of Washington's eye by the 1960s. In fact, on the eve of the Uprising of '67, everybody in the Johnson administration could not say enough good things about Detroit. Detroit had succeeded, it said, where a lot of other cities had failed to solve all kinds of racial tensions, to solve a lot of the economic problems facing other cities. Detroit was, as I've said many times publicly, the apple of Washington's eye. And then, for those of us who live here, we know that these images are very painful because these became the public images of Detroit for about 20 years, but particularly in the last 10 years. And that is the visual of Detroit in utter collapse. The Detroit that nobody wanted to own and everybody wanted to dissect. How many books have you seen with the ruin porn of the city of Detroit? How many magazine articles? How many people have come to the city sort of to treat it like a spectacle, an oddity, a strange thing? What in the world happened here? And we have a lot of explanations for how we got to that really kind of devastated place. And I want to talk to you quickly about two of them. The most popular, certainly nationally, but I would also venture to say a great deal locally, is that the Riot of '67 happened. And that use of the term is very deliberate on my part. I don't call it a riot publicly. I call it a rebellion. I call it an uprising. But in this configuration, it was definitely a riot, which is to say Detroit was doing just fine. It was great. It was glorious until some people tore it up from the inside, burned down their own neighborhoods. Lots of different explanations for why that was, but in general, the narrative was civil rights gone too far, people wanting too much too quickly, and really a completely chaotic, incoherent reaction to what, in everybody else's estimation, was going just fine. That's one explanation. And in fact, if you look in so many national understandings of what happened to Detroit, when you get those ruin porn pictures, this is what happened to Detroit, the Riot of '67. The other very popular explanation is this is what happened to Detroit, our former mayor Coleman Young. And these are related. The idea was that we had an uprising, black folks tore up the city, then they elected a black mayor who had absolutely no intention of working across racial lines, who made it inhospitable for white folks to live here, and who was difficult to get along with. And it was on his watch that the city began its slow decline, and that's why everybody left that had means, money, the tax base, and so forth. So we need to talk about that, and we need to talk about it because, frankly, there's another explanation. It's not just that, but it's related to the first one, white flight, right? Everybody leaves Detroit, meaning white people leave Detroit, and that's why the city collapsed. And to be sure, look at the data. It's pretty significant. White folks did clear out of the city of Detroit. My book, which I hope you'll get a copy of, explains how all of these things are not quite, though, linked in the way that you might think they are, which I'll talk about in just a second. And the other argument, the final argument, is deindustrialization, right? That's the other thing that happened to Detroit. So that toxic cocktail, unrest, Coleman Young, white flight, and deindustrialization all happened to Detroit. And I want to just leave you with this thought before I go on to what I think is an equally powerful explanation to what happened to Detroit, to say to you that while it is true that deindustrialization dealt a vicious blow to the city, it dealt a vicious blow to many northeastern cities. And this, what happened to Detroit, did not happen to them. Similarly, white flight happened in many northeastern cities, and we cannot account for all of Detroit's decline simply on the graces of white flight. We also cannot blame this all on Coleman Young, as popular as this is. The fact is that Coleman Young was elected both by black and white Detroiters. The fact was that he did not tell white Detroiters to leave the city. He actually integrated the fire department, integrated the police department. He did not make it an all-black department. He did not say whites were not welcome in the city. And the previous explanation, which was about the rebellion of '67, we can talk about that more in Q&A, but it just simply doesn't hold up. The reason why there was the riot, actually the rebellion of '67, was because Detroit was not okay even in '67. There were deep, deep cleavages in the society, deep inequalities, and there was a very, very serious problem of police brutality. And that's one of the things that the movie of 1967, Detroit, chronicles. So we're going to talk about all that more in Q&A. But I want to suggest to you, just moving forward, because I don't have a lot of time today, that there's a whole nother thing going on in this city that helps us to understand what happened to it. And I really think about it like the elephant in the room. This is something that nobody ever talks about, but it turns out dealt a devastating blow, not just to Detroit, but to many cities across the nation. And it actually is related to this issue of crime, punishment, and policing that was already an undercurrent in 1967. This is a story I tell in my book, Who's Detroit?, the new version, and it's also the story that I tell in my book on Attica. But today, I want to tell you about it, how it actually played out.